Hey everyone, Kibler here, and today, sort of throwing it back, I'm doing a talk today with you guys about the current state of balance in Hearthstone. And unlike my usual discussions, today we're actually going to be focusing on Battlegrounds. I've actually been pretty happy in general with the balance and the response of the balance team to the standard mode in Hearthstone. My biggest complaint, generally speaking, has been that I wish we had more changes, more stuff to do to mix things up. I feel like Battlegrounds, obviously, it's a lot easier to just change things in Battlegrounds. You don't have to release new cards in quite the same way as you do in Constructed. You don't have to figure out how people are going to acquire them or things like that, so you can shake it up more frequently and more significantly, which is one of the reasons that I think that Battlegrounds has a lot of attention of a lot of people, including myself, right now, thanks to the most recent update adding elementals and new heroes. Obviously there were some balance changes in standard, but those were mostly just kind of quality of life changes and nerfing, more or less removing kind of a problematic deck that wasn't that popular. So it wasn't that big of an impact. The format still kind of feels like it did before, but of course we are very likely to have a new expansion on the horizon for standard, and obviously that'll shake things up pretty huge. But for now, I want to talk about Battlegrounds. Battlegrounds, has obviously been a very popular and very successful game mode since it was introduced almost a year ago at this point at BlizzCon. And I think that in general, the team has done a great job of keeping the format fresh, keeping the mode fresh with new cards, nerfs, additions, hero additions, etc. And I feel like the recent release, the elemental release, I've been having a lot of fun with it, but I've also been pretty concerned about some of the play patterns that have emerged, both with card issues as well as with hero issues. So I'm going to start with the first, which is what I view to be card issues in Battlegrounds right now. I think that most people have seen that elementals have tended to be a fairly dominant archetype, fairly dominant tribe within Battlegrounds recently. And part of that, of course, is the new rotation kind of policy. The fact that 2 tribes are removed from every game means that elementals, as the only one that are guaranteed to be in for now, are far more likely to be very prominent in winning compositions or just things that you see all the time in your games. So there's sort of a mentality of confirmation bias of like, if you think elementals are too good, you're going to be seeing them all the time anyway, as opposed to, well, I don't see dragons win that much. It's like, well, dragons are out of 2 out of every 7 games or whatever, whereas elementals are not. I guess it's actually 2 out of every 6 because elementals are not. So one out of 3 games, you don't have dragons. So even if dragons are like as powerful or more powerful than elementals, you won't see them as often, so won't have kind of the visceral emotional impact that seeing elementals be powerful in virtually every game will be. But from a card perspective, as opposed to that more structural perspective, I think that the big issue that I have right now with elementals comes down to Nomi and Little Rag. I feel like elementals is the only tribe that has 2 cards that significantly snowball their board, whether their current board with Little Rag or their future board with Nomi, that are both tier 5. The biggest play pattern that I tend to see and that I tend to go for right now in Battlegrounds is to try to triple on tier 4 to discover tier 5s, because tier 5s include the 3 cards that I currently think are the most powerful to accelerate you to a game-winning composition in Battlegrounds, which are Nomi, Little Rag, and Bran. Obviously, Bran is essentially tribe agnostic, but at least in my experience and my perception of compositions that I've seen, if you get one of those early, you are by far more likely to win the game than if you don't. And that's obviously going to bias the compositions that you see, successful compositions that you see, pretty heavily in favor of elementals, because while other compositions are like, okay, well, maybe I can get a mama bear, maybe I can get, it's not even necessarily anything really good in like tier 5 for like mechs. There's like Baron maybe for some mech comps. Obviously Bran is more the Murloc thing than even Begurgle is, in terms of how much it actually enables you to scale. And it's not even just these are like, they scale you, right? And in some meaningful way. Like something like a Goldorin obviously scales your composition, but it's not just Goldorin that scales your composition. It's Goldorin plus Macaws plus Baron. Either Little Rag or Nomi plus whatever elementals scales your composition endlessly too, right? There's a cap on how a lot of a lot of these cards that can scale you will continue to scale you, right? Obviously, Bran is sort of excluded from that because it magnifies the power of other cards. But like Little Rag and Nomi, every single elemental you get from now on is scaling your composition to some extent. Obviously, it's different between the two of them, but both of them lead to the same thing, which is you have just these boards of absolutely massive stuff that really is difficult to compete with unless you have something like Calicos plus Nadina or something like that, right? And that's kind of what we see as the answer to these endless stat scaling builds as, okay, well, I have either also endless stat scaling plus Divine Shield, or I have Poison plus Divine Shield, kind of as what feels like the only counter to these sort of things. I think this is also kind of magnified by, like the Divine Shield Wind Fury unit, that if that gets scaled on a ton, it can literally kill your entire board if you're something like, say the Goldrin composition, right? Say you're a Baron Goldrin composition. Often it's like, well, if you attack first, it's the difference of like, okay, do you have this extra unit? But if you don't attack first against a Divine Shield Wind Fury like 80/80, your entire board dies unless you are one of these compositions that already has itself an absolutely enormous build, or Divine Shields and Poisonous Minions, etc. The biggest individual card change that I would feel like I'd want to make is to make likely Little Rag tier 6 would be my go-to. I'd like to probably swap Little Rag and Gar. I feel like Gar is something that's cool, but it's an individual unit that doesn't massively scale everything else that you're doing. Whereas having both Nomi and Little Rag at 5 just gives you access to so much scaling, so much earlier than a lot of the other tribes, factions, whatever, end up having in order to, complete their own compositions. I feel like Gar is often kind of just like not nearly good enough when you get him relatively late, and could be, a pretty exciting tier 5, but again, is just an individual unit that it scales rather than scaling all of your stuff like a Little Rag will do. Similarly, I think there's, probably some other changes that could be made to some of the existing cards. One of the biggest ones in terms of scaling that I feel like could be changed is Lightfang, right? Lightfang was one of the OG busted cards, right? Getting your triple into a Lightfang on tier 5 when you get to tier 4, triple into a tier 5, was often just like, okay, this is the most powerful thing you can do. Part of the reason for that was the fact, of course, that Lightfang was +2/+2 instead of the +2/+1 that it is now. But part of that, too, was the fact that every composition had an Amalgam then. That was when Nightmare Amalgam was a tier 2 unit, and you were pretty much guaranteed to get a Lightfang buffing an entire board pretty quickly. At this point, there's like very specific units in each tribe that you want to pair with Lightfang, and otherwise, if you get an early Lightfang, you often aren't even that excited about it. It ends up really, I think, making the Menagerie compositions much less appealing. Menagerie compositions would generally vastly prefer to have Bran than Lightfang, which, at different stages of the game, of course, this is a different choice, right? Early, Lightfang is giving you a bunch of free stuff. Later, Bran gives you a bunch of stuff faster, which is what matters. But I'd love to see just that nerf reverted, because I feel like compared to a lot of the scaling options that exist now, whether they're Little Rag Nomi or Calicos or whatever, that have been introduced since the Lightfang nerf, on top of the fact that when Lightfang was nerfed, it was far easier to take advantage of thanks to the tier 2 Nightmare Amalgam. And you can say, well, now there's Amalgadon, but scaling an Amalgadon with like +2/+2 compared to like all the other things you can do with Amalgadon later in the game is just not that impactful. And, I feel like encouraging people to build Menagerie type builds and, try and take advantage of Lightfang could be, an interesting play pattern to try to help promote, as opposed to just like elementals, which is what I feel like most of the best compositions end up being right now. But overall, I'm having a ton of fun with the current patch, and just trying to find ways that I feel like it could be improved. And from a card perspective, those are where I would like to see some changes. I'd like to see another tier 6 thing that's more exciting, right? One of the big things right now is like, I almost don't want tier 6s because the tier 5s are better in terms of getting them to scale early. And right now it's literally just dragons that I'm really excited to try and get a tier 6 for, and making elementals have a tier 6 they're really excited about. Obviously, Gentle Jin is also pretty exciting, but that's exciting from like a economy perspective rather than like a raw power perspective. And the sort of the balance between between, well, do I want Little Rag, do I want Gentle Jin, I think is a more interesting decision than, like, you know, Gar. I think that Gar is you know, probably a exciting minion to get at tier 5, but starts to fall off and scale pretty poorly once you actually get to tier 6. So those are the changes that I think I would experiment with, you know, as far as the card pool itself is concerned. The other big question in my mind for Battlegrounds is the hero pool, right? I feel like the way in which the team on Battlegrounds approaches heroes has changed pretty dramatically over time. Most of the early heroes that we had were things that, like, kind of had a little bit of a minorly impactful power, just sort of more flavor in some cases than anything. And, you know, obviously some of them were better than others, but that's always going to be the case when you have, you know, a range of stuff that all tries to interact with the, you know, the same pool of minions, etc. But I feel like we've seen just more and more powerful heroes being released. Obviously, the most recent example is Ragnaros. I think it's fairly obvious to basically everyone that Ragnaros is egregiously overpowered. I think he has the highest statistical average placing if you look at data aggregation from HS Replay. I think his average placement is like 3, with a massive bias toward first place. And, you know, when you look at it, like, his hero power comes online around 8 or 9 gold most games. And then gives you +8/+8 in stats every turn. And I get that +8/+8 is Ragnaros stats, right? He's an 8/8, throws 8 damage fireballs, you know, kind of harkening back to Ragnaros in Hearthstone. But it's too much if on average, because, I mean, if you have 8 gold, you get +8/+8. Ta-da, we've got all these 8s, it's Ragnaros, but it's too good. Ragnaros needs to also be able to get 8th place in order to make that fair. But obviously, yes, you have a hero power that doesn't do anything for a lot of the game, but compare, say, his hero power to, say, Bigglesworth, right? The hero power that you get for Ragnaros comes online around 7 or 8 gold, well, actually 8 or 9 gold on average, I believe, and then gives you +8/+8 every turn for the rest of the game. Bigglesworth is, well, you still don't have a hero power, usually until like 10 or 11 gold, and then you get a minion from the person who died. So you get a minion from the person who had the weakest army, right? These are just clearly not comparable. And again, hero powers aren't necessarily supposed to be directly comparable and you know, totally equal in terms of power level, but I think it's just so clear that Rag is so out of line compared to a lot of other heroes that I would love to see him change. Thankfully, there are a lot of knobs to turn on Rag. I feel like Rag could require more minions to die if you want to keep the 8 number. Maybe it should be 30, maybe it should be 40. And increasing this number, like, a lot is not even something that I feel bad about, because the power level of +8/+8 per turn is better than a Light Fang. Your hero power is better than, like, a Light Fang or, like, a pretty good turn with Bran that doesn't require you to spend any gold. Like, it's just such an incredibly powerful effect that having it not happen until, like, 10 gold on average, right? I think it would be totally fine, and Rag would still probably be a pretty good hero. He would definitely trend down and be, like, more likely to actually get eliminated, and less likely to get first place because he has less power overall, but would still probably be pretty good in those circumstances. You could also reduce the amount of power you actually get if you want to keep it at 20 minions so it happens earlier. Maybe it's +2 on each of them, right? Maybe it is +1, you kill more, it scales up, it's +2, you kill more, it scales up, it's +3. Something that makes it so it's not just like, well, you're getting a Light Fang, you know, pre-nerf Light Fang worth of stats every single turn just by being Ragnaros and not being dead, like, on turn 6 or whatever it is. I think there's a lot of things that could change Ragnaros. I really hope to see Ragnaros change, because I feel like the moment that I go up against Ragnaros when he has his hero power completed just feels so dispiriting, and you just feel like you get knocked out by Ragnaros more than, you know, pretty much anything since Eudora, just because of the amount of raw power. Thankfully, unlike Eudora, you don't necessarily just take tons of extra damage. Old Eudora, of course, because they have a bunch of high tier stuff in play. They just have low tier stuff that's extremely powerful because they've been pumping it since, like, turn 7. Speaking of heroes who have low tier stuff that's really powerful, let's talk about Jandice. Jandice has obviously been a fairly controversial hero for a while now, because she's obviously extremely powerful. Prior to Rag, she was the clear #1 hero. A big part of this is because of Jandice's ability to just swap back pogo hoppers and keep rebuying and replaying and just pumping up pogo hoppers to crazy amounts. Like I've had like 300 pogo hoppers with Jandice, and that's not even the highest that, you know, anyone's ever had. Of course, I'm sure people in the comments are gonna be like, my biggest pogo is this, my biggest pogo with this, and please do sound off, because I want to hear how ridiculous people's experiences have been with this hero, because it's pretty egregious, right? And I actually really like Jandice. I think a lot of the play patterns that Jandice does allow for are really cool and interesting, but not that one. And I feel like Jandice could be more interesting if you just removed Pogo Hopper. And I get that there are a ton of people who love Pogo Hopper, and back in OG Battlegrounds, there were, you know, games that would be won by like Shutter Walks with Pogo Hopper, or people who'd like force Pogos with like, you know, even more recently like Bran or whatnot. But I feel like the likelihood of Pogo Hopper being a card that is relevant in a game of Battlegrounds when there is no Jandice is extremely low. It is mostly a card that everyone is sad to see on the board, and just makes them have like, you know, an experience where like, oh god, nothing to buy here, maybe I'll power level, or just generally be displeased by seeing a Pogo Hopper. Except for Twitch chat, they always say switch to Pogos right now. And I can get how it has this like kind of mascotish feeling, but I think the game would be more fun right now if there were no Pogo Hopper. And a big part of that is Jandice. And now obviously there are other things. You could change Jandice's hero power if you really feel strongly about preserving Pogo, which personally I don't. Pogo's been around since the beginning of Battlegrounds. It's had its day. I feel like legit Pogo builds that are not Jandice builds just basically don't happen anymore. And it almost universally is just something that feels like abuse from this new hero. And I feel like you can keep the hero with its hero power as it is and just remove Pogo from the pool, and the game in general I think would be more fun. So that's a solution to changing Jandice. Not even changing Jandice, just getting Pogo Hopper out of the pool, and suddenly Jandice becomes a hero that, yes, can be very powerful if you're swapping back and forth like Strong Shell Scavengers with a board full of taunts, or Battle Masters when you know, have built a big one already. Those are interesting uses of it. But when the most common use, and often just the most powerful use, is just using a very easy to acquire 2-star unit, I think that just really is kind of boring, and it takes away a lot of the coolness and frankly the kind of like play skill element of Jandice, because it's so obvious what such a powerful thing is to do that she just ends up doing it all the time, and it, you know, kind of becomes this relatively boring thing. I think that it's also pretty important to make some of the changes to the elementals I was talking about, you know, at least making one of Rag or Nomi or whatever tier 6. I think it should be Rag again, because I think Nomi is just too bad if you get it that late. The scaling, I think, may be, you know, too hard to get going, but maybe I'm wrong on that. Maybe either Rag or Nomi could be 6, but both of them at 5 are also really abusable by Jandice with swapping things back and forth and just keeping, you know, continuing to get triggers for both of them. So those are the two, I think, like heroes that I feel like there are obviously issues with and obviously fairly straightforward solutions for. You could also like obviously just make Jandice's hero power cost 1. I think that gets rid of a lot of the cool uses for her in a lot of stages of the game, and doesn't really solve the Pogo problem, because she still just gets crazy Pogos. They're slower, of course, so maybe it's okay. I'd love to approach it in a different way than just like make it cost mana or make it dramatically different. Like, for instance, I feel like the Captain Hooktusk change took Hooktusk from egregiously powerful to like almost uninteresting and useless. And I wish that the Hooktusk change had been different, right? Because I think Hooktusk is an interesting hero. I think Hooktusk has an interesting power. If it just wasn't able to do the ridiculous economy things that it did before, I'd love to see Hooktusk changed back to the hero power it was, but cost 1, so that you can do this kind of like discover, try and do cool things by sacking stuff, but you can't just like farm tokens to like build out a board and triple early in the game, because that's what's so egregious about her. But anyway, I'm not going to go through every single hero, but those are a couple that I have thoughts on. And the bigger thing, I think, is actually, I'd love to see, much like I'm discussing with Hooktusk, a couple of changes to some of the weaker heroes, because I feel like the newer heroes, like I said, are just so powerful. We've seen some buffs to heroes, like Reno, of course, Jaraxxus, both have received massive buffs since their original incarnations. Reno, I think, even started at 4 for his hero power, then got changed to 3, and now is 0. Same thing with Jaraxxus. Jaraxxus, I believe, cost even, it was either 3 or 4 to start to use as the hero power. Now it's 1. this obviously shows a, just overall better understanding, as well as just an increase in a lot of the power of what heroes do. And I'd love to see that approach taken to some of the older heroes. I feel like we could very easily nerf Patchwork. Patchwork feels like just getting a little bit of extra health isn't nearly as powerful as a lot of the other stuff that heroes have. Just having the like 60 health or whatever it was that Patchwork originally had would be fine. And I think that would be actually a hero that's like, okay, maybe I can change the way I play and take a little bit of early damage because I have this big buffer. And, rather than like, I guess I can take like one hit, because there's just so much extra damage these days. Similarly, I feel like AFK possibly could just go back to a tier 3 and a tier 4. I feel like the metagame is such that, there's no more Cobalt into, Iron Sensei, which was one of the totally insane things that you get. Cobalt alone leaving makes the tier 3 so much weaker. Comparing AFK to a lot of more recent heroes, she just like doesn't really have a lot of the power. And I mean, like, let's look at like Bartendatron, right? We have like Omu or Shenvala, all these things that just kind of do Bartendatron's job better. And I get that, as I've said, some are going to be better and worse than others, but I just feel like given the really, really high power that we've seen of a lot of these new heroes, that one of the best ways to kind of make the game fresh and feel like you have more options, and it's not just like the murderer's row of the top heroes every game, is to try and give a little bit more strength to some of these original heroes, a little bit more oomph, so we see greater variety of things going on in the games themselves. Anyway, I don't want to ramble too long, but those are most of my thoughts on Battlegrounds right now. Again, I've been really enjoying the game mode and having a lot of fun with it, but do think that toning down some of the best heroes, bringing up some of the worst heroes, and taking another look at same thing with compositions and tribes. I did say that I think that the biggest changes that I would make are specifically the Little Rag or Nomi changes. I'd love to see a little bit more love given to pirates and demons too. I feel like they don't really have that much going for them in terms of especially endgame compositions compared to others. You look at like, the best possible game with like pirates these days, and you like have like a golden Hogger and golden Salty Looter, and your opponent's just like, okay, well I have, again, like an 80 power Divine Shield Mega Wind Fury that kills your entire board before it gets to attack. Nice attack triggers, bro. It's kind of hard to justify going a lot of the other faction routes, especially considering you don't need that much to get these other tribes going. Most importantly, elementals right now, again with the pair of hyper-scaling 5-drops they have in the form of Nomi and Little Rag. So let's address that first and see where we're at. So anyway, thank you all very much for listening. Let me know what your thoughts are on the current state of Battlegrounds balance and what changes you'd like to see, both to cards, card pool, heroes, etc. And let me know what you think of this video. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this, be sure to like and subscribe. It does always help. This was, I think, the first time I've ever literally said that in a YouTube video, but do it. Thanks for watching. See ya.